You're watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
I didn't set out to write a book that would help people. I set out to write a book that would help myself, which is what I've done with every one of my books. I had questions that became sort of burning questions that I needed to explore, and the way that I explore everything that I know about life is as a writer on the page. One of my favorite writers is Joan Didion, and Joan Didion has said about her own work that if she had even the remotest access to her own mind, she never would have become a writer, and that she writes in order to understand what it is that she knows, what she thinks, what she fears, what she feels, and that is very true for me. And so a couple of years ago, I had moved with my husband and my son from the city to the country, to 10 acres on a hill in what felt like the middle of nowhere, which is actually the very small town of Bethlehem, Connecticut, right next to Washington Depot. And we had been through a very challenging time. We left the city in the wake of 9/11 and also in the wake of our son's very frightening illness. When he was 6 months old, he had been diagnosed with a seizure disorder that affects 7 out of 1 million babies, and only 15% of them make it. And we had a miracle, and he was completely fine. When we first moved to Connecticut, my mother was also diagnosed with lung cancer and was dying. My father had died very many years earlier. So there was trauma. There was, a sense of the other shoe dropping, or always the possibility of the other shoe dropping. But at the same time, it was a very peaceful and contented time in our lives. Our son Jacob was okay, our marriage was great, our careers were, it was one of those times in life where you wake up in the morning and think, I'm lucky, this is a lucky time, this is a good time. And yet at the same time, every night, like clockwork, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, I was waking up into this state of kind of a panic. My heart was pounding. I'd look at the clock, it would say 2:58 or it would say 3:01. It was always right sort of in that zone. How many people here wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning? I love doing this I think the first time I did this in an audience and I saw 2/3 of the hands go up, I thought, there should be one of those maps of the United States with little, red dots, little red lights on, wherever it's like, woman awake, woman awake. Because the thing about that is that one feels so alone in that time, at that moment, in that state. And I didn't understand what it was. I had a sense that, I began to have a sense that it was some kind of spiritual crisis. I don't know that I would have even used that word, spiritual crisis. I didn't think I was, sort of in line for a spiritual crisis, but there I was having one, or, maybe another term for it would be an existential crisis. It was a feeling that I was falling and there was nothing to catch me. It was a feeling of I can't protect the people that I love, and how do I live with that? A feeling of I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, none of us do. How am I going to live with that? And I would just wake up with all these roiling feelings. It was as if I was going through my day and multitasking and getting everything done and working and marketing and getting dinner on the table and making sure homework got done and having all my to-do lists, the many to-do lists and the things on the refrigerator and all of that, and getting my kid to bed and reading and going to sleep, and then suddenly at 3 o'clock in the morning, there it was, like the thing that had been kind of just behind me all day long had kind of like caught up with me. And My previous novel, Black and White, had come out recently. I was sort of casting around and waiting and trying to be patient for the next idea to emerge. I assumed I would be working on another novel. And then one day, I was in the middle of my yoga practice. I had a very long time yoga practice, and I was in tree pose, which I won't demonstrate for you since I'm wearing heels. But I was standing there, with one leg up and kind of my hands like this. And suddenly the word devotion materialized. It was like as if it was in neon. I saw the word devotion. And along with it was the realization that, I wasn't going to write another novel. I was actually going to write another memoir, which was a horrifying thought. I never thought I would write another memoir. And the even more horrifying thought was that I needed to explore what this was that was happening to me, that I needed to write a memoir in some way about the kinds of questions that my son Jacob had been asking me. He was maybe 6 years old at the time, and 6, 7, and he was asking me the kinds of questions that kids ask about God and about death, and about what I believed. He would say, what do you believe? Do you believe in God? What do you think happens when we die? Where do we go? Those kinds of questions. And I had been raised in an Orthodox home in New Jersey. My father was from an Orthodox family from New York, and my mother was not Orthodox. She was in fact an atheist. There's a moment in Devotion where I run into my mother's oldest friend at an art gallery opening. My mother had passed away, and her friend Beverly said to me, I never forgave your mother for marrying your father. This is quite something to hear. And she went on and she said, she was an atheist. What was an atheist doing with somebody with 2 sinks and 2 dishwashers? Now, I could tell you the story. Well, actually, it's probably worth telling you the story. It's not in the book, about how my parents met, because my conflicts about what I was going to do with myself as a spiritual seeker, coming from this Orthodox home, having abandoned any kind of ritualized Judaism probably around the time that I went to college, not replacing it or doing anything about it for a long time, but filled with conflict about pride about where I came from, confusion about how to incorporate it into my life, confusion also about, was it possible to incorporate aspects of it or elements of it into my life and not the whole thing. There's a story in Devotion where I was with Michael and Jacob, and we were in Venice, Italy, and we went to the Jewish ghetto. And my husband Michael, who's Jewish but would describe himself also as an atheist, we wandered into a Judaica store, and Michael said, "Let's get a mezuzah," which I can't begin to tell you how unlike my husband that statement was. Let's get a mezuzah. And I have a suitcase full of mezuzahs in the basement of my house. I have mezuzahs from every home, my parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, but I didn't have one on our door. And I thought, this would be a lovely thing to get a mezuzah. So we were looking at this beautiful Venetian silver filigree work, and as we were standing in the Judaica store, I started to have a panic attack. I started feeling completely claustrophobic in this place and like I needed to get out. And I thought, what in the world is going on with me? I'm in a Judaica store in Venice, Italy. Why am I panicking? And afterwards, and after we did leave and we bought the mezuzah and we had it in its little plastic bag, and I realized that what was happening was that mentally I was counting every doorpost. I was trying to remember how many mezuzahs I would need to do this properly. It wasn't just a mezuzah for the front door, it was a mezuzah for every door, but there were certain doors that they didn't go on, and I couldn't remember, and I didn't know the bracha, and I didn't have a rabbi, and so the idea of affixing a mezuzah, of buying a mezuzah at that moment felt to me like it was overwhelming because I couldn't do it right. I couldn't do it the way that I had been raised, and if I couldn't do it that way, then perhaps I shouldn't do it at all. And the revelation of that moment for me was that the all or nothing way that I had been raised was leading me to nothing. It wasn't going to lead me to all, and it felt to me that the only other option was nothing. And I didn't want to be there anymore. I wanted to find a place where there was the possibility of something genuine, of something meaningful, of something relevant that I could introduce or reintroduce into my life and into my family's life, and I didn't know how to do that. But to go back to the story of how my parents met, because really who they are and how they found each other completely leads us to why I wrote Devotion. My father was from a prominent Orthodox Manhattan family. His parents, my grandfather founded the Lincoln Square Synagogue down by Lincoln Center, and many yeshivas in Israel. And when my father was married for the first time, he married a young woman. This was in the 1940s, late 1940s. He married a young woman from another Orthodox home. It was very much an arranged, shidduch, an arranged marriage. And it was a very unhappy marriage, and 6 years later, and one daughter later, they were divorced. This was, anybody want to say the word with me? A shanda. Yeah. In the Orthodox world of the 1940s, this was practically unheard of divorce. And he actually got partial custody of my half-sister, which was also very unusual. And then went on with his life, and a number of years later, he met and fell in love with a young woman from another Orthodox family. She actually, by those standards, wasn't that young. She was 26 and unmarried. They planned to be married, and a couple of days before their wedding, my father's best friend called him up, and he had discovered that her name was Dorothy, was dying. She had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which at that time in that world was a death sentence. And she didn't know. Her family knew, her parents knew, and hadn't told her. And they didn't tell my father because they wanted her to have some happiness, in the last little bit of time that she had. And the way that my father's best friend found out was that there was a cousin who was a doctor. She was frail and she was in and out of the hospital, and he got suspicious, and he looked up her medical records at Beth Israel Hospital and saw that she was dying. And my father, those of you who have read Devotion know my Aunt Shirley, my father's younger sister. My father called Shirley, and the two of them decided not to tell their parents because my grandfather was a real patriarch who would have had opinions about what to do about this. But they did want rabbinic advice, but they needed to go outside the fold. They knew so many rabbis, but the rabbis were all friends of the family. So they ended up going to see Menachem Schneerson. They went to Borough Park, and I should just digress to say that I didn't know any of this growing up. This was not a story that was part of my knowledge of my father's history. I was 17 before I knew Dorothy had existed, and my half-sister just said the name Dorothy one day, and I said, "Who's Dorothy?" And she looked at me and she said, "You don't know? You don't know about Dorothy?" And I was much older. I was in my early 30s before I knew the story I'm telling you. My father had passed away. He had died in a car accident when I was 23. And I was writing my first memoir, Slow Motion, and I was in my early 30s, and I realized that I was the same age as my father had been when all this had happened to him, and that it was so young to have had so much pain and suffering, and I really wanted to know what had happened. And so I did what I do when I really want to know something, which is I decided to write about it. And I got an assignment from the New Yorker to write a piece called The Secret Wife about my father and Dorothy. And it was a nonfiction piece. It was not a short story or fiction of any kind. Every single thing that I put into that story had to pass muster with New Yorker fact checkers, which are the fact checkers to end all fact checkers. And the two people that I was writing about were both dead. So the piecing together of this story, my Aunt Shirley is blessed with an extraordinary memory. She will remember what somebody wore and how they smelled and what the weather was like that day and what the cab driver said. I mean, she's absolutely an amazing witness to her own life, and such a gift for me that I have that. But there were many people who many people who told me this story and pieces of this story, including Dorothy's sister. Anyway, Menachem Schneerson told my father to postpone the wedding. That was his advice, which was something that I didn't understand at all when I heard it. It made me very angry at the Rebbe. I thought, like, that, he's telling my father to be duplicitous in a way. How can, to string her along until she dies? My father married Dorothy, and 6 months later she died. And my father, whose name was Paul, became known in that community, several people told me this, as Poor Paul, which I think was what the Rebbe was trying to save my father from, and it's why it was rabbinic advice, because my father was going to go on living, and in the Orthodox community, this man who had been kind of the golden boy was now Poor Paul, was somebody who had bad luck, and who maybe wasn't going to have such an easy time finding another bride, which leads me to my mother. So I guess about a year and a half or 2 years after Dorothy's death, my father had moved back into Manhattan. They had been living in Brooklyn, and he was living on East 9th Street. And he was with my Aunt Shirley one day. It was Shabbos, and they were walking home from shul. And coming the other way up East 9th Street was a lovely woman in her early 30s, and it was Shabbos. She was carrying a hammer. That was my mother. They say that in the first moments that you meet the person that you're going to be with, you discover everything you really need to know about the relationship. If you really look back and you think about the encounter and the dialogue and what happened between you. When my parents met, it was Shabbos. My mother was carrying a hammer. My father was with my Aunt Shirley coming home from shul. He should have known. But he sort of had an instant, he was drawn to her instantly. In fact, was not given her last name, but knew that she lived on the block and that her first name was Irene. And he went through the Manhattan white pages looking for Irenes on East 9th Street until he got to my mother. Her name began with an F. If her name had begun with like an X, I would not be standing here today. I'm quite convinced he would have given up at some point. But so my mother was a modern and dynamic and very assimilated, had grown up on a chicken farm in New Jersey with socialist, immigrant socialist parents. They started dating. They could not have been more different in many, many ways. But as they were courting, my father said, if we were to be married, you would need to keep an observant home. And if we were to have children, it would be my requirement that children of ours would be raised observant. And my mother agreed. And she did keep an observant home, but she was an atheist with 2 sinks and 2 dishwashers. She never became someone who embraced or found the beauty in or the meaning in what my father found the beauty in and the meaning in. And when they had me, and I'm their only child, the conflict over how to raise this child was so extreme between them. I went to yeshiva until I was in 7th grade, and then I went to prep school. It was like my father won the argument until I was in 7th grade, and then my mother won the argument after that. And I could tell you many stories. When I was 3 years old, I was the Kodak Christmas poster child. I was that billboard in Grand Central Station wishing the entire world a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And I still, to this day, and I will never know, it's going to be one of the central mysteries of my life, how that happened. Because my mother always said, well, it just kind of happened. Well, you don't just end up on a billboard. And my father sort of enjoyed, I think he was conflicted. And in some way, their conflicts over all this were acted out by me or, upon me. And so there was no possibility that I was going to do anything other than flee at a certain point. There's a lot in devotion about being a little girl and watching my father daven, and going to shul with him. I adored my father. I had a very conflicted and complicated relationship with my mother. And so much of that, to fast forward until, I have a 6-year-old child saying to me, what do you believe? The question was so loaded. It was so complicated. And I also knew as a mother that I was failing him because I was opting out. You know how your kids absolutely know when your response to a question is just sort of radioactive, like I just don't want to go there. I just didn't want to go there. And I felt like I had to, the combination of that and the 3 o'clock in the morning, wakings, made me realize that I had to go there. I came upon this quote fairly early on when I was writing devotion. It was from Carl Jung, who is really the poet of midlife in a lot of ways. Jung defines, by the way, midlife as anyone age 35 and up. Just, I love saying that too to people. They're like, ah. Jung wrote about midlife, thoroughly unprepared, we take the step into the afternoon of life. And I read that, and it's like just, it gave me chills. I recognized where I was. And he went on to say that what works, the tools that we have, these aren't his words, but the tools that we have that got us through life's morning are of little use in the afternoon and will by evening have become a lie. And I intuitively understood that to be true. I knew that the things that had enabled me to get to the place that I was were no longer working. And that ready or not, I was taking the step. And I wanted to try to find some way to develop or understand or have insight about, or at least really explore what I believed. And so Devotion is a book about my search for something to believe. It's not, my editor called me just as I was starting the book, and if I hadn't already sold the book to her, I might not have answered it so honestly. But she said, do you think you're going to come up with an answer? And I think, in that sort of, eat, pray, love kind of way, I think she was really hoping that I would say, yes, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is going to be my path towards answers. And instead I said, no, I think what I'm going to do is live inside the questions. And I don't think I even understood when I said that how true that would turn out to be. What else is there other than living inside these questions? There's a moment in the book where I discovered the writings of Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk, who writes beautifully about his spiritual life, and he's in a dialogue with God. He is, always in a dialogue with God, and he writes at one point, "If I think I know you, I am mistaken. If I think I understand you, I am deluded. The darkness is enough." I wanted the darkness to be enough. And I think in part because of the complicated way in which I was raised, I felt that if I had doubt, that meant that I didn't have faith. Or that if I was grappling with something or confused about something or skeptical, then that somehow meant that my faith had failed me and was failing me. And I have done such a 180 on that. Everything that I learned during the years that I was working on devotion, every teacher that I encountered, and I encountered some extraordinary teachers, made me realize that doubt is an element of faith. That doubt isn't the triumph of, it doesn't triumph over faith, or it doesn't, that it resides in the same place. And just briefly, for those of you who haven't read the book, one of the things I really decided, or that I felt, this wasn't going to be about going around the world in search of answers. I'm sure many of you have had the experience of going off somewhere and then coming back home and thinking, I'm really going to hold on to this thing that I learned, or I'm really going to hold on to these habits or these rituals. And then 3 days later, it's gone, because you learned them somewhere else. And the sense that I had was that what I needed to know was right in front of me, and that my eyes hadn't been open. That it was right in my own backyard somehow. I didn't even know what that meant. It was all just a feeling. It was like I was feeling my way through the wilderness of all this. And almost as soon as I decided this is what I'm going to explore, things started happening. And the first thing that happened was, well, it's become almost like a joke about this book, but ultimately I met a Buddhist, a rabbi, and a yogi. If I had started this out saying, I'm going to go meet a Buddhist, a rabbi, and a yogi, it probably would have been a terrible book, because it would have been about having an idea. This is what I'm going to go do, and I'm going to go do it. I'm going to have this experience so that I can write about it. I wanted to have the experience. The writing about it came out of that. It was a book that I needed to write, therefore, it was an experience that I needed to have, therefore I wrote a book about it. And and I did meet a Buddhist, a rabbi, and a yogi. I couldn't have combed the world over and found 3 more perfect teachers for me. The yogi is a man named Stephen Cope, who is the director of something called the Institute for Extraordinary Living at Kripalu. He's also a former psychotherapist and a lapsed Roman Catholic and a very literary guy, deeply intellectual. We met when I had been asked to do an event, a charity event at a library in Litchfield County, pretty far from my house, about an hour away. And I had said yes, and it seemed like a long way away when I said yes. And then on the day that I was actually doing the event, I was kind of grumbling to myself, thinking, I can't believe I have to do this. It's a hot day. I'm going to be under a tent with all these other authors. I'm not going to sell any books. Why am I going? And I got up there, grumpy, bad attitude, and I sat down in front of my books, my pile of books, and there was an author next to me. I hardly even registered. And I should just backtrack and say that somebody had given me this book called Yoga and the Quest for the True Self. That was one of those books that you fall in love with and you carry around in your bag and mark up. And I was reading this absolutely amazing book. And it's by Stephen Cope. So I'm sitting at this table, and the author next to me leans over and he says, "Hi, Steve Cope." And he became my friend, and he became my yogi in the book. And I had always wanted to go to Kripalu. How many people have been to Kripalu? It's amazing, and it's only about 90 minutes from here. And they have an extraordinary range of programming. It's totally overwhelming to even look at it. But I'd always wanted to go, but I was never going to go. The idea of taking 3 days away from my family felt so self-indulgent to me, and I had such resistance to doing it. And it's outside of my comfort zone, and it just wasn't something I was going to do. And then here was this man who runs the entire yoga program at Kripalu, sitting next to me, and we become instant friends. And so then the next time a catalog came, I looked for his program. And he was doing a program with a Buddhist named Sylvia Boorstein. But I wasn't going for Sylvia Boorstein. I was going to go for Stephen, and Sylvia would just be this person who maybe I would have to listen to so that I could then listen to Stephen. So I get to Kripalu, and I write about this in Devotion. There's my friend Stephen, and next to Stephen is this woman in her early 70s, and she begins to speak, and almost the instant that she begins to speak, I feel like she's speaking only to me, that this is the voice that I've just needed to hear my whole life. And I'll tell you this, on the drive here today in the back of the car, I had my iPad, my iPhone with the, you can tell how technically, the thing that you listen to music on, iPod. I have all the I's. And I was listening to Sylvia. I was listening to, there's an incredible resource of endless meditations of many great Buddhist teachers, and it's completely free. It's on a thing called dharmaseed.com, and you can download, there are thousands of them, and just have them on your iPod. It's such an extraordinary resource. And anyway, Sylvia started speaking, and I thought, oh, you're why I'm here, you and Stephen. And she had a book, she's written many books, but she had a book in the Kripalu gift store that I'd seen earlier that day called That's Funny You Don't Look Buddhist. And it's about both being a Buddhist and an observant Jew. She travels the country teaching rabbis how to bring aspects of meditation and other kinds of practices into their congregations. And Sylvia became my Buddhist. And finally, Bert Visotsky, who is a rabbi at the JTS, who doesn't have a pulpit, he's a scholar. A friend of mine, who some of you may have heard speak before, Abby Pogrebin, she is a very close friend, and she had a Torah study once a month at her home, and she said, "Why don't you join my Torah study?" Now, in the past, if somebody said, "Why don't you join my Torah study group?" I would have just said no. I had enough Torah. I was good. There was nothing for me there, nothing to learn at all. And instead I said yes. I mean, this is so much for me a lesson in saying yes, just saying yes, and kind of getting over the knee-jerk impulse to say no, I'm not comfortable, or no, that makes me nervous, or no, I'm a little afraid, or no, I'm busy. I said yes, and then the first time I went, Bert Vysotsky is like one of the great minds in modern Judaism, and talking about Genesis as if we were in the world's best book club, like really talking about it. At one point, one of the members of the group said, "Why are we reading about these people? They're terrible people. They do terrible things to each other. It's like the most dysfunctional family in history." And he's like, "Well, yes, it is." And he said, "Because they're our people. They're our people. And this is our story. This is instructive, to us." And going there once a month. And so I've talked longer than I planned on, which I always do. I just want to kind of conclude by saying, in the year that Devotion has come out, I have spoken probably at 100 different more, places ranging from synagogues to churches. I knew something was going on at the beginning when one of my first book tour stops was LA, and when I looked at my list of what I was doing for the week, I was speaking at 2 synagogues, a Federation event, a Unitarian church, a yoga shala, 2 bookstores. It was just this, a charity luncheon. It was this total range of people. And what I realized is that there is a hunger, a kind of unrecognized hunger for a dialogue about spiritual life. When the book first came out at a party in New York, Erica Jong came up to me and she said, she had just read the book, and she said, "Honey, you've written a book about something more intimate than sex." And I thought, uh-oh, look who's talking. But that's what I've discovered, and that's why I really want to leave time for discussion, because that is, in fact, the case, I think, that many of us are hungry to actually have these kinds of conversations, because the thing that I discovered is I thought I might be writing my smallest book in writing Devotion, my 7th book. I thought it might be a book, the first book I've written that nobody would read, because it was so idiosyncratic and so specific to my own experience. And I was afraid it might be, too Jewish for non-Jewish people, not Jewish enough for Jewish people, too Buddhist for Buddhist people, not Buddhist. It felt like such an utterly specific evocation of my inner life that how could it be resonant? And instead, quite the opposite has happened. And what I've seen is that I've never felt less alone in my life than I have in the years since I published this book, because the stories that people tell me, and also the people who say to me, "This is my story," when the details of it aren't their story, but how similar we are on the inside, and how when we can actually really get away from the details of the outside and talk about that, it's a really extraordinary thing. So on that note, I would just love to open it up and have a conversation.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.